Today is Thursday, May 1st, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson, and I'm here again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace G. Smith. Mr. Smith, a rare double podcast day.
It is. And, these are even going to air out of order, actually. I think we recorded one. We have another one planned for next week I'm excited about, and then hopefully this one after that. But we need to do it every once in a while. It's good.
Yes.
It's good for us.
Now, I'm looking forward to next week as well. Our continuing, kind of like Star Trek, our continuing mission to bring people that are in important roles in the work that you may not ever have a chance to meet or from other regions to come and talk to you. And I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, our podcast today. What is our topic, and what is the question we are trying to answer?
We are looking in the news and seeing all these claims that an extinct species has been resurrected. We're going to talk about that, whether it has actually happened or not. What does that even mean? Is it a good idea or a bad idea? And we're going to ask the Jeff Goldblum, Ian Malcolm question about if we can do something. Does that mean we should do something? And we're going to do it with our biblical Smarty Brain hats on. So we're going to do some biblical thinking. Welcome back. It is always good to have all of you here on the podcast. And before we get into the topic today, I do want to remind everyone that on the livingyouth.org page, Mr. Jonathan McNair, Mr. Ryan Dawson, they are beginning to post information about camp. Of course, every camp, we always put pictures from camp. Plan on doing exactly the same thing this year. Put pictures from camp on during the summer, but actually putting content out there and things that you need to know in getting ready for camp. So please go out there and keep in mind you need to check out livingyouth.org fairly regularly if you plan on going to camp. And for today's topic, the news, I like science. I like exciting things. When they first used to talk years ago about resurrecting a woolly mammoth, I don't know about you, Mr. Robinson, but I always thought that was a kind of cool idea. I wouldn't mind seeing actually this ancient extinct thing that we see all the time. And then, of course, the movie Jurassic Park came out, and then I realized I guess everybody would die. I guess if you did that, everybody dies.
I totally agree. Actually, I wanted to see a woolly mammoth again. I thought a saber-toothed tiger would be pretty neat. Dire wolves, that's fine. But I'm going to draw the line at reptilian creatures that can run faster than you. They're bigger and stronger, and they'll eat you in one bite.
Yeah, but according to the movies, I guess they start off with lawyers. So we just got to keep an eye on the lawyers and make sure all of them are okay. And as long as they are, we're all good to go. So how are we going to tackle this topic?
Okay, so let's break it down into two primary components. First, let's ask the question. So what has happened? Because I've heard different things. Some people said this is basically just another wolf with other wolf-like features. I've seen stuff that says there's actually quite a bit more programmed DNA going in there. So what has happened here with this dire wolf? Did they really recreate an extinct animal? And then what are the implications of that? What is the real issue of successfully, quote unquote, successfully resurrecting old animals as it were and bringing them back to life?
All right. I think it's a great structure. And so let's just focus on the facts first. For those who may not be aware, time gets the most attention because I think they made it a big cover. I mean, they put them right there on the cover. If I recall, if I'm thinking of the right image, it was a fella holding one of these massive, one of these critters. So, but it was reported in lots of different places. In fact, on my screen here somewhere, I've got a BBC article on the topic. The claim is that this company, it's a private company called Colossal Biosciences. It's an interesting name. Colossal Biosciences. That the claim was that they've resurrected this extinct species. It's a species of wolf called a dire wolf, which I think is, they picked that on. I don't think they picked it for that reason, but is this a dire event? So anyway,
sounds like you don't want to run into one because that would be dire.
It does, but anyway, so they took this species, and it's been extinct according to your traditional scientific dating for more than 10,000 years or so, 12, 13, 14,000. I'm not going to speak to that. I'm just going to say that's the claim. But regardless, there's none of them around now, and they scraped some DNA samples from here and there, some different locations where you could find some for this wolf. And then they compared them to the DNA sequence of a gray wolf, which, they're getting really good at sequencing things. And then here's the thing. They then used, I don't know if they used CRISPR itself. It's been so long since I've read some of the articles and it's faded, but some of you out there listening may be familiar with the CRISPR technology. It's technology we have now. We essentially have the ability to edit DNA like you'd edit a word processor. You misspelled the word, the English word there. You wrote T-H-E-I-R instead of T-H-E-R-E. You go in, you change that letter, and you make it different. With CRISPR, we can do that now. And when it first launched on the scene, it was remarkable and stunning and, of course, spooky. We'll get to those kind of things later. But it's the kind of technology that you see. Craig Venter, for instance, he's I say brilliant, but sometimes these guys just run companies and they're not the source of the brilliance. But I do think he's very smart. It's how they've in a sense, by hand, if you will, it's not literally by hand, assembled DNA to create original genomes so that they've made bacteria. I say made bacteria. They've kind of scooped out, if you will, the genetic material of bacteria and placed in DNA they made themselves. And next thing you know, the bacteria still functions because it's got its code. It's just different code. So they're getting very good at this. So what they did was they took the gray wolf DNA, like say in an embryo, like a fertilized, cell, but right at the very beginning. And they were able to actually switch out, compare it. I think they found 19 places where there were in different chromosomes where there was significant differences, and they altered the gray wolf DNA to match the dire wolf DNA. And once they changed it to look the same, then they took the resulting embryo and they placed that in a surrogate. I think it was actually a dog, a hound of some sort, but regardless, something that could actually deliver the babies. And they've had 3 different pups from this. There were 2 twins, which they called Romulus and Remus, which is just perfect. After the twins that supposedly, the brothers that founded Rome, who nursed from a wolf. So Romulus and Remus. And then there was a female pup as well that was born that I think they called Khaleesi, which I don't watch Game of Thrones. I haven't seen it, but I feel like I've seen that name related to that.
Well, I think almost anybody, just a normal average person who is familiar with the dire wolf, probably got that from Game of Thrones.
Really? I would not be surprised.
I had heard of them from other things, which we won't go into when I was younger.
I should have looked it up, but I know that the dire wolves have like a white hair, so that might be related. But they do look. I mean, if you look at these pups, so you look at the larger full grown ones, or I say full grown, they're larger. They're beautiful animals. I mean, really, they just look. I just think they definitely don't look like gray wolves. They do look different.
The dire wolves are supposed to be larger, like noticeably larger. And interestingly, actually have shorter legs, so they're not as fast, but they're supposed to be stronger, like more robust.
Interesting.
And one of the theories about why they went extinct was there wasn't enough megafauna, large animals around anymore for them to hunt.
Really?
And so they went extinct. They're more wolves are really very successful hunters and take down big game as far as we're concerned. But something like a woolly mammoth might be too difficult for them. So I would like, I'm on the record. I want to see a woolly mammoth.
Well, one, they work in packs, right? So who knows if they did in the past, but I would assume that they did.
I think we know.
I think we know they did?
Okay. Yeah.
And then also, I think Colossal what was the name of the company? Colossal
Biosciences.
Yes. They actually, I think the woolly mammoth they're on their plan. I think it's the next target they have.
See, I'd heard that they were trying to do that before I heard about the dire wolves, and that they the woolly mammoths are similar enough to the elephant that the elephants could be a surrogate, and that they felt pretty confident about that. I did a little research, and because there was a lot of debate over how much of the DNA they had for the dire wolves, and they say it's not bad, but it's definitely not complete, and it's not really complete enough to really get a full dire wolf. So it does seem like we have a facsimile of a dire wolf, but not as close as a real one.
Well, I like the quote. There's a BBC article, experts dispute claim dire wolf brought back from extinction. Now, before I even get into it, I will say that there's kind of some social pressure as well to not say this has happened.
Yes.
Because you have a lot of those out there trying to protect endangered species. and they don't want the message to be, we can kill anything we want. We can just bring it back. Give us a test tube and a microscope,
That
a little
had
CRISPR.
never occurred to me. I didn't even know that was an option.
That's right. I'm going to kill all the bison, or whatever. I'm going to eat everything. Well, anyway, that's so. There's as a result, there's some social pressure to not say this as well. And I don't want to give into the social pressure, but no, there's real questions. This BBC article by Victoria Gill, science correspondent for BBC News, it looks like it's published April 8th, 2025. They made a great point about the DNA you're recovering, because you go to movies like Jurassic Park, and they have this fantasy process where you find a mosquito that was trapped in some amber, and it sucked the blood of some dinosaur, and they're able to extract this DNA from this mosquito. Well, this guy, in this particular case, he's a paleogeneticist. And you're thinking, what in the world? Well, he looks at ancient DNA from ancient creatures. His name's Dr. Nick Rawlins. And he said essentially kind of what you said. He's from Otago University. And the article says he explained how ancient direwolf DNA extracted from fossilized remains is too degraded and damaged to biologically copy or clone. For example, his next comment's really interesting, but those of us old enough to remember Dolly the sheep, that was actually more cloning. That was where you just takes a DNA strand and you actually just clone the original critter. In this particular case, he says when it comes to ancient DNA, he says ancient DNA is like if you put fresh DNA in a 500-degree oven overnight. He told BBC News it comes out fragmented like shards and dust. He says you can reconstruct it, but it's not good enough to do anything else with. So essentially, you're getting the fragmented pieces of this creature's DNA, and you really are just sort of putting it together. Now, I hate to make all the obvious comparisons to Jurassic Park. That was one thing I really thought, and I don't know, I never read the book by Michael Crichton, so I don't know how faithful they were to some of the ideas he put in that book. I couldn't tell you. But I remember the movie. I definitely saw the movie. It had music by John Williams. That almost, but doesn't quite guarantee I'm going to see it. Definitely doesn't guarantee. But in the presentation, they talked about getting this DNA, but then they talked about how some parts of it were missing. They didn't have it all. And in that case, I never really understood this, and I realized how it drives the plot. They just filled in those parts with frog DNA. They said, we just use frog DNA. Well, I do admit, even watching the first time, I thought, why in the world would they use frog DNA?
Surely that won't come back to haunt us.
Well, I would think they'd at least pick something that is theoretically, evolutionarily, quote unquote, more related to dinosaurs.
Like a monitor lizard or something.
Yeah, or something. Or for that matter, these days they say the closest relative to a T-Rex, they say, is a chicken.
Wow.
Yeah, go take that how you will. Some say that. But regardless, instead they pick frogs. Well, I recognize as part of the plot, they eventually wanted I think they were all female dinosaurs. That's how they're trying to control to keep them from reproducing. So they made them all female. But there are some frogs that can change, that actually can in certain environments where there's not enough of one sex, they start birthing multiple sexes. So in that regard, that's how they have. So that is a plot point. They want to make sure the dinosaurs can reproduce. But in this case, they've done they kind of did the same thing. They just took the DNA they had and compared. Now, were there pieces that they couldn't find, so they just made their best guess? Yeah, really, if you look at it realistically, they haven't resurrected an old species. There's a possibility that, well, one, there's no continuance. There's none of that old species that suddenly we've brought it back to life. What they have done is taken a current living species and have genetically modified it to look like that. It's kind of like if they took you, Mr. Robinson, and took your DNA and modified it to where you look like Bigfoot. And it's just
so much hairier.
That's right. Let's assume Bigfoot was real. Well, that wouldn't mean they suddenly resurrected Bigfoot. It does mean they have now modified Mr. Robinson to look like Bigfoot. Now, the thing, though, is if you do that enough, if you really do change all of the DNA, you'd have a much stronger claim in saying that, well, we might have resurrected the species in that sense, but we have created it anew, not from scratch, but we have taken this other species and so modified it that it's as if we have reestablished this kind of animal on the earth. But the one caution I'll throw about even that is the idea that we are, I'm learning this more and more, and I appreciate, I hate to keep referring to the evolution booklet, but it's just, I love the topic and studying these things. And the more you do get into how life is actually built, the more you realize it is so rich and complicated. Like, for instance, D is far more than DNA even. There's complications. There's things you inherit that is even beyond your basic DNA genetic inheritance. And in all of those things, for us to truly, absolutely reproduce those animals, where if you took let's say some ancient doctor that used to study dire wolves, you freeze him like Captain America, you thaw him out later, and you give him one of these where he would in no way be able to know the difference. I think that is an incredible stretch. I think that if you had some expert in the past and he'd say, hey, this almost looks like a dire wolf, but yet they don't have this, or the mitochondrial DNA seems strange, or the epigenetics, the if you will, the operating system working on it doesn't quite seem the same. So there's those kind of details, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things I had read that was actually interesting is much of that information is gone. So how the genes express themselves is lost. So you can still recreate those DNA fragments, especially if you take the gray wolf and kind of fill in the blanks where you don't have everything you need. Yeah, you're right. It is interesting because it's probably best to say that they've created a facsimile of a wolf that seems like it's kind of a gray wolf with dire wolf traits.
Dire wolf version 2.0
or
something. It's almost like if you had a classic car and you wanted to reproduce that car, and man, maybe some people on the surface, it looks like, I can't believe finally, I don't know cars, Mr. Robinson. I couldn't tell you a car that could be resurrected.
That's actually a good analogy.
Is it?
Yeah, because a lot of people rebuild these muscle cars, but the question always becomes, do you restore it to factory, which means it has to have the original engine and the same parts, or, hey, those old carburetors weren't the best. Let's put a new carburetor on here that's designed to go with it. Then at what point is the muscle car no longer really that old 1967 Camaro or Corvette or something, because the internal parts of it are just entirely different from the original that came from the factory?
Man, Robinson, I will trip over a good example any day. I don't mind accidentally finding a good example.
Okay, so then what's the hubbub about? What are people's concerns? Where can this go? Like, what is the real issue behind concerns for, or even people who support doing this kind of genetic rebuilding of lost animals?
Well, really, it's the same kind of concerns they had when CRISPR, the technique was first devised. You saw a lot of people, once they had this ability, you just saw it apply. Like, think of the things we could solve. If you knew a family was prone to a particular genetic disease, you could take the embryo, or say the initial. You have sperm and egg combined. Now we've got a person. But let's take that. Let's examine that DNA and let's take a look. Oh, look, there's the disease. Let's just edit that disease out and fix it. And now the person doesn't have that disease. It seemed like a wonderland. But then you start realizing, well, are we really wise enough to do that, right? Because what if by fixing that, we don't realize how interconnected things are and we cause a different kind of problem? Not only in that case do you cause a different kind of problem, but if you affect things at the germline, so to speak, it's now being reproduced in humanity. You've created something that is being reproduced in humanity. And yet our ability to do that is just growing and growing. Our technological capacity, our understanding of, let's just say, some of the programming of life. We're not at Jurassic Park kind of levels, right? But we are getting there very quickly. And it does bring up the Ian Malcolm warning. I'm toying with whether we can even put Ian Malcolm in the title, and I just feel like no one's going to remember who that is. But because he was the mathematician in Jurassic Park, I always remember his name because he was my hero. It's like, hey, one of the math guys we got in the movie. So Ian Malcolm was played by Jeff Goldblum. And he was brought into the Jurassic Park review experiment, him and then the paleontologist and the lawyer. And he's the one, and it's very memeable. You'll see it in a meme here and there. But he's the one who's chiding the wealthy guy, Hammond, I think, who paid for let's resurrect all these dinosaurs and make a big park and everybody can come see them and how wonderful that would be. And he's the one who's horrified at the idea. And he tells the old fella, he says, you were so busy trying to figure out if you could that you didn't take the time to think if you, I'm not quoting exactly, that you
Yeah,
didn't take
but
the time to think
that's-
if you should
Yeah.
do it. And that is our question. The promise of this technology to potentially heal, et cetera, is amazing, but the potential for harm is so great. And have we grown? Has our moral capacity to decide what should be done and should not be done grown in concert with our technological capacity? And I would 100% say no. I don't see that.
No, in fact, it actually concerns me more and more every year about how much technology we have at our disposal, and yet we don't always ask, is this a good idea? Because we could justify it so many different ways, or there's a profit to be made on it. But we don't. We just, as human beings, we have a limited capacity, and we don't have the capacity. Well, I mean, we're truly meddling with things that are beyond. I mean, we can't make life.
Right.
You know,
Right.
there's so many things we can't do. God created it in a certain way, but now we have tools to kind of dabble at it. You know, it's one of my favorite sayings. What could go wrong? You know, and I was thinking about doing some of the show prep. There's already a lot of animals. They've already at least done DNA modification.
Oh yeah.
Like they have salmon that they've modified so that it reaches maturity twice as fast, and we're assured that look, they're going to be kept in farm raised enclosures and they won't get out. Guess what? They got out. There's concern over them breeding with real salmon, and what are the implications of that? And
Right.
how many things like that? And this is even more dangerous. This gene editing technology.
Yeah, you look at, I mean, Mr. Robinson and I are both, I know we have an international audience, but Mr. Robinson and I are both Americans. That means we're generally eating a good big old spoonful of genetically modified organisms here and there, even if we don't want to necessarily. Yes. Corn is one of the most genetically modified organisms on the entire planet. People would be surprised if they actually looked into the genetics of corn. And it's a staple here, right? And America does not have a whole lot of restrictions on that. So we are playing with essentially some of the most fundamental coding, if you will, of life. And mankind doesn't have a good track record with actually doing things well and wisely. I think if we turn to the Bible, there's good biblical cause to be concerned. And this might involve a little bit of speculation, Mr. Robinson, but I do think it's in the right neighborhood. Things like this always, well, I say always, strong word, at least almost always, take me back to the Tower of Babel and the account there. And I know it might take a little bit of time, but let me read the first 9 verses of Genesis 11. Now, for those who don't know, when did the Tower of Babel happen? A lot of people hear about the Tower of Babel, and they just know that's when the languages were confused and such. Well, it was after the flood. A lot of speculation that the flood might have been why they built a tower. Maybe they wanted to survive the next flood. What's going on. But regardless, if you just stick with the biblical text, it says so much just in and of itself. So it's after the flood. Mankind is actually, God wanted, he told Adam and Eve to, hey, go be fruitful and multiply, spread across the earth, Well, here you have at Babel them not doing that after the flood. You have them sticking in one place, not spreading out and doing these things. So let's read in Genesis chapter 11. We'll read verses 1 through 9. It says here in the New King James Version, "Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower, whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Now, right there, before we go on, they're literally declaring their intention not to do what God said. God wanted families spread across the earth. Let's build different countries. Let's build different peoples. Let's build a world.
Apparently, they hadn't been keeping up with current events and the flood, and
apparently not. So they say, hey, you know how to not have any border problems, not need any borders because we're all just one country. So in verse 5. It says, "But the Eternal came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Eternal said, Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So it says the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth, all the earth. So he forced them to do his original plan by utterly confusing them so they could tell that we really are not one people. We have to stop. We need to make these. Okay, anyway, that said, it's clear why he did it. He's very plain about why he does it. You know, what they wanted to do. They didn't want to be scattered over the whole earth. But at the same time, his comment, and I know you know exactly what I'm looking at, Mr. Robinson, in verse 6, where he seems to be focused on because they're unwilling to scatter, he says something very important. Because they're all together and they speak one language, he says at the end of verse 6, now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. It is not unreasonable, and this is, I want to be upfront when we speculate. It's not unreasonable to propose that this is part of his concern, that when you have one people working together like this, they can achieve over time anything they want. Now you might think, why would God want that? Why would God want that? Wouldn't he want us all working together? Let me suggest why he wouldn't. Look at the kind of things we do when we work all together. You know, the United States is one of the leading distributors of what, thanks to the internet and technology? Pornography all over the world. You know, what is it that we tend to do with unlimited abilities? We tend to do terrible things. We know that God had a 6,000-year plan for mankind to allow man to learn his lessons. If we were unlimited in our capacity, how much earlier would we get the nuclear bomb? How much earlier would we? Right. And God wants his plan to last as long as it's going to last. So it's speculative, but I do think that's part of the concern, is that it wasn't a good idea that corrupt man would have such unlimited capacity. In fact, forgive me for just looking at one more verse. I say forgive me for looking at the Bible there, but there's one other verse. We know what mankind was capable of doing and being before the flood, because it says plainly before the flood in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5, it says that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Human nature is still human nature. Can you only imagine if all of us get to this point and then we're all unified in what we do? So, yeah, mankind is very capable of overreaching his moral grasp with his capabilities. Yes. And it seemed like God was trying to slow that down.
Yeah, no, I mean, at the risk of sounding like, you know, you're preaching to the choir, I could not agree more. I think that's exactly right. God wasn't difficult for him to see down the years, like where we would end up.
Right.
And, you know, funny, this reminds me yet again of something I've observed. Probably not an original thought, really, but how much the current time period we live in mimics the time right before the flood. And we are back to a point, you know, God slowed things down for his purposes and for mankind to learn a lesson, but we're kind of back to pre-flood again a little bit, where, you know, if you live like those guys did, so many of those times, you know, when we have the how long they lived, and it's 800-900 years.
Yeah.
I mean, just imagine whatever age you are, and then add 800 years to that. That's how much longer you're going to live. How much could you have more become an expert on
and not
something?
As a 100-year-old man in our current 100-year-old man bodies living another 800 years, but imagine your growth and such, Matt, corresponding to that. So you've got centuries of youth and strength, you know, and capability, sharp mind.
So that would give you a long time to perfect things. And what is the one thing that mankind seemed to perfect right before the flood? Evil. And, you know, with some of the tools we have look, we already have nuclear devices that can end us under, you know, we forget about that. You know, you and I growing up, particularly in the 80s, under the shadow of the Cold War, we were well aware of nuclear Armageddon, but we've kind of seemed to have forgotten that there's a whole lot of nukes out there and bad actors, and it's not hard to imagine a world war going again. And now we have artificial intelligence that we don't seem to put any limits on. And, you know, it's not, I don't know that it would go like that kind of Terminator style Skynet kind of thing exactly. But truly, what happens if you give robots guns and AI and let them do whatever they want? I mean, there's all kinds of dark scenarios ahead of us, and we may not live as long, but the globe, we're back to the earth being connected again, and there's the internet.
Right.
And what do you want to know? You and I talk about using Chat GPT all the time. What do I want to know? Pull it up and find out. I wouldn't. Actually, I wonder where its limits are. I never asked it to do anything nefarious, but
Good.
but
I'm encouraged by that.
I try to be that guy. But without rambling on further, it just so many things that set the stage for the flood are kind of back to where we are now, and God's allowed things to play out because we need to learn the lesson. And I think one of the lessons is, well, if I just let it go, you would eventually make the devices that just wipes you out.
You mentioned AI, and we don't have to have a say Terminator scenario or the Matrix or something where the machines take over for things to go bad. They talk about giving AI a certain amount of autonomous, like the argument's been made, like why would you agree to autonomous cars where cars drive themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the one argument you would make is if you can eventually prove that an autonomous cars would actually increase the safety record. Like it's measurable. We can see even if some of the deaths are more spectacular, we can demonstrate there's less harm and there's fewer deaths. So they've talked about the same thing in the military. If you you give AI some measure of control over deciding to fire or not fire, shoot a missile, not shoot a missile. If you can prove there's less collateral damage, that the decision is often more accurate, et cetera, it'd be a matter of time. But here's the thing, that doesn't have to lead to a complete AI apocalypse with everything. People often highlight how, World War I starting with essentially an assassination. I know there's other factors, but in the right environment, a single assassination becomes the seed that launches an entire globe at war. You could just have AI make one call. Something makes one call, and it doesn't make a difference whether it was a person or not a person. Everything fall apart. But man, just nailing it, Mr. Robinson, with talking about the turn of the conditions before Noah. It's Jesus Christ Himself said that as the days were the days of Noah. You should expect those things when He's coming. Now, if you look at that, His statement there in Matthew 24 and parallel passages. He clearly is emphasizing, among the things, the suddenness of it. That in Noah's day, there are people that were probably busy still pointing and mocking at Noah and the boat building family, the weirdos over there, while the raindrops start hitting them in the face. And they had no idea. He'd been preaching at them. They'd been dismissing him and them. And then sure enough, their destruction came upon them. That clearly is a main point that Jesus Christ is trying to make, that as people are going to mock the preachers of righteousness and the ones saying this is coming, it is going to catch them unawares. But it's hard not to also conclude, looking how he brings up not just Noah, but also Lot, that, the destruction comes for a reason. It came in Noah's day for a reason. It came on Sodom and Gomorrah in Lot's day for a reason. And so it's very reasonable to think that was also a part on Christ's mind. That, hey, guess what? During the sinning, terrible days of Noah, when destruction came, you're going to see those kind of days again. And you see this, without going in a lot of detail today, but you see a lot of the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah today, whether you want to go into the perversion or you want to get into the lack of hospitality, whichever angle you want to take on that, the whole shebang, it's present today. You look at the days of Noah and you look at the things that people are interested in terms of violence. You look at the kinds of things that entertain us on our screens. You look at the kind of things you look at the videos that people will watch on the internet. You look at the stuff that interests us. The days of Noah, I think we fully should expect to see. And the Tower of Babel, take that same mentality, keep mankind together. What would human nature produce? In this specific case, today's program, we're talking about genetic manipulation. When CRISPR, again, came out, that suddenly people started asking questions. And they wanted to make sure there was it was actually the first time in a long time I'd really seen it come up outside of issues like, say, abortion, things like that. What are the ethical controls on this? Wait a minute, what are we going to do? Because there were actually some out there saying, hey, I'm going to start making designer babies. I'm going to start doing this. I can't. And they said, whoa, hey, should we even do something like that? And now what are these pups that were born? They're not human, but they were designer babies is really what it is. You can imagine it's not like this, a gray wolf mom and a gray wolf dad saying, you know what I want? I want my son to be big. I want him to be stronger. If his legs got to be shorter, that's really cool. And you know what would be cool? White fur. I mean, just white, stark white. I don't want to look like us. I want to look like a machine. And then that's what you got. We're looking at that kind of ability where, what if you want a blue-eyed, blonde-haired baby? Well, then, hey, guess what? We're increasingly have the capacity to do that. We are growing in our ability to manipulate life itself. And who amongst us thinks it would stop at just the color of your baby's eyes?
Exactly.
Honestly, if you're a carnal military, if you don't believe in God, and you believe that the best thing you can do for your country is the toughest, strongest military you could possibly put together, if you didn't want to go the Captain America route, you'd almost be foolish.
My personal experience has been that's exactly right. Once we open Pandora's box, or once we stick with my metaphors here, once the genie's out of the bottle, we don't ever get it back in. So if we've already started this and nobody's made enough of a fuss over it and there's not legislation in place to prevent this, we're just going to go on to more and more and keep expanding the possibilities.
Right. To me, it seems the only time we have stepped back from the brink sometimes, but still not the same as putting the genie in the bottle, to stick with your metaphor, has been nuclear war. On one hand, it seems like a long time since 1945, right? And was it you? It might have been my wife. Not that I get y'all confused very frequently, but someone said to me recently that it's actually kind of shocking that we've only had 2 cities since 1945 that essentially have been destroyed by nuclear weapons, given how they've proliferated. I think the idea, you talked about the Cold War a while ago, is so terrifying of what we could do that, yeah, there was a little bit of a hesitancy. Mm-hmm. But, there wasn't a hesitancy to keep making these weapons.
Yeah, bigger and bigger.
Oh, absolutely. If it's going to go to kill time, we want to all make sure that all of us have the power to kill as many people as possible, and that's what they've done.
If you ever get a chance, there's I'm sure there's more than one, but I'm sure I saw this on YouTube, but a video that shows every nuclear test that we've done.
I have seen some like that.
Insane. I had no idea it was so many. And then you see the way that it just does a red pop every time there's a test. And so we hit some point in the 60s where it's just popping constantly, bigger and bigger ones. Mr. Weston also has an article that talked about during the Cuban Missile Crisis just how close we came.
Oh yeah,
to a nuclear exchange, and so I don't actually give mankind much credit that we haven't had another major nuclear conflict. I attributed that to the grace of God and Him working out His plan, and we're just. I find I want to say lucky. That's not the right word.
Yeah, right.
But we haven't not had a nuclear exchange because of great restraint and maturity of humanity.
I think that's a really good point. Again, God has a plan. He did what He did at Babel because He has a plan. And I suspect you are very much right. We have not really been in an environment for a while where people have even been tempted to pull a trigger. And what a beautiful mercy that is. And yet at the same time, how long could that possibly last? Especially when you have, why did nuclear arsenals grow in the first place? Well, because you don't want the other guy to have more, right? I mean, it's all, was it Alfred Lord Tennyson? Alfred Lord Tennyson. I think I always mess up that name. Tennyson.
Is this a Star Wars character?
No, maybe he's a poet. But he talked about how the world is red in tooth and claw, like the animals, just bloody claws and teeth. And that is the way mankind, apart from God, we kind of told God, hey, we don't really need you. We don't need your morals. We don't need your laws, your rules. We can manage our own affairs. And so, okay, that's fine. Then you're going to be like the animals, what you're going to do. So what have we done? We've built a world that's red in tooth and claw. Civilization has given us a veneer to allow us to pretend that it's not like that very much. And yet, country versus country, well, same thing with genetics. Who wants to be the last country to not be developing stronger soldiers, whatever that case is? Who wants to be the country that isn't curing all the disease, but then all the other things as well? Nobody wants to be that last country.
Well, a lot, that reminds me, a lot of the science fiction movies I saw growing up, especially in the 80s and maybe the 90s, that try to project where we'll be in the future. And it was things like super soldiers. And you know what? We are on the cusp of that, or perhaps we don't even know what's being done, in the deep recesses of military research. But like those movies we grew up with don't seem so implausible anymore. A lot of that technology is available to do things like that.
Yeah, I remember I saw so many of those movies when I was that age. I was into them back then. I didn't realize I was looking into the future, but I was very much into them. I feel that, well, we might say what difference? Hey, look, if we can improve humanity, why would that be bad? If we can make, let's say we can use genetic engineering, make all of us faster, all of us stronger. Again, it's not just a matter of, say, even the morality, it's the wisdom of how we do it. And yet when you're rewriting humanity, Mr. Robinson, it's like there's no sense that humanity is something sacred anymore. Whether it's the transhumanist or the transgenderist or those who kind of feel that humanity is like a Play-Doh, we can do whatever we want with it. The Bible is plain that mankind is made in God's image. There is something sacred to humanity. And when you decide to open up the gene box and I want to rewrite everything the way that I want it and the way I think it ought to be, there is very much the risk of treating something sacred, which is human life made in God's image, in a profane way. And it is hard to imagine anything fundamentally good coming. Temporary goods, to be sure. Temporary goods, but not something fundamentally good forever.
Well, not to go on about it, but like everything we do to modify ourselves and make ourselves something more advanced and faster and stronger and more intelligent and everything is really a step away from what makes us human and what makes us unique and made in the image of God, as you said.
Yeah, the key thing is, apart from God, there is nothing morally that prevents us from doing these things. There is no true, fundamental, objective, moral code, real right and wrong, that is unquestionable apart from God. Mankind has kicked God out. So what is there to tell us any of these things are wrong? Frankly, if I want to make a blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby, who are you to tell me that's wrong? And without that, with every major growth in our ability, it's hard to imagine it won't get worse. So first, as we wrap up, let me just say this. Hey, there's nothing wrong with thinking this is cool, right? I mean, it is. I think do you think because of all this we have to abandon our interest in seeing a woolly mammoth one day? Do you think we're morally wrong for wanting to see something like that?
Yeah, that's the best question so far.
Now I wish I hadn't asked it, because I'd still like to see that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the money going into the space program. I recognize we could do so many better things with that money on Earth. But at the same time, are we going to do those better things with the money? I kind of don't think we are, right? And are we using some of the things we learned from the space program probably to do bad things? Yeah, probably so. At the same time, I love seeing pictures of other planets. Yep. I love seeing those probes. So I hope it's not morally wrong. Like, let's say I'm not saying, hey, go out there and do that, guys. But if they do produce one, I think it's okay to think it's really cool. It's fascinating.
I don't think. I would have to say I do not think it's morally wrong for them to try to pull DNA together and try to, I hate to use the word resurrect, but bring back a facsimile of extinct animals. The ethics come in where do we go from there? It was just because your point is where do we go next? Where do we go next? And when, after taking a bunch of baby steps, when have we actually crossed over a line into something that has become unethical?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think we can even wrap up with those thoughts. Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong years ago used to say that there are really few things that are just morally wrong in and of themselves. It's how you use it. Mankind, I mean, really, who created the genetic code? God did. And the ability, just like it's good to set a bone, right? If you break a bone, it's good to try to restore it to good shape. If we truly were founded in God's righteousness and his character and what's right or wrong, we would be trustworthy stewards of the genetic code. You could trust us to go in and ask for his help and to seek his guidance, especially if we had an actual relationship with him like the whole world will have in the millennium, to go in there and do good things. The reality is, it's like, is it good or evil? What's like, is electricity good or evil? I can use it to turn on the lights and I can see my say a grandbaby or something in a crib, but I can also flip the switch that launches a whole bunch of nuclear weapons at my enemies. It's not that the thing itself is good or bad. What we're looking at is what will we do with it? And we should have no doubt on that regard. Everything that mankind creates that it can do terrible things with, we eventually will do terrible things with. And in this case, we're talking about the capacity to rewrite the biological code of life at its most fundamental level. This is an area of research that we absolutely have to keep an eye on.
Smith and Robinson.